This conference will now be recorded.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen, and to my colleagues on the panel. Welcome to the Professional Investor Fund webinar on AREF. My name is Andrew Dale. A couple of announcements just to start things rolling. First of all, could everybody make a switch camera to new active speaker so that you can see the person who's speaking on the screen? The second announcement is that we have a slight change in running order this morning. Emma Cullen has unfortunately had to come off the panel because she has been called away on a family emergency. Fine, but she's been unable to attend this morning to give her views. I have on the panel three very interesting colleagues. First, I have Melville Rodriguez from Ocorion, who has been significant and instrumental in getting this very interesting product into Her Majesty's Treasury and to get things moving, and he'll talk to us. We have Stephen Palmer from DTZ Investors, who will give his view from the perspective of fund managers. And we also have Christopher Austin from Schroders Real Estate, who will give some views on the impact from a taxation perspective. And Christopher chairs the tax committee for AREF. So without further ado, I would very much like our first speaker to step up, as they say, and move things forward. I hope we have a very interesting session.
Thank you, Anthony. Good morning, everyone. In the next few minutes, I will highlight a gap in the real estate fund structures currently available in the UK. I'll examine concerns about funds domiciled offshore, and I'll comment on potential advantages of the professional investor fund. Next slide, please. When considering whether or not to invest in a fund, we look at a range of factors, with structure and liquidity being two of the most important. Decisions on structure are usually client-led, and there is often a trade-off between structure, liquidity, and returns. Unlisted closed-ended structures typically offer the cleanest exposure to the underlying asset type, but liquidity options are limited. This presents an issue because fund terms are typically 7 to 10 years, and one might want liquidity to accommodate asset allocation changes, portfolio rebalancing, or redemption requests. Some closed-ended funds have periodic or infrequent redemption windows, but the most likely exit route is via the secondary market. Over the last 10 years, the UK secondary market has grown in terms of both number and volume of trades, but the secondary market typically trades offshore vehicles where the transfer of units is not subject to stamp duty land tax. Onshore closed-ended vehicles rarely trade, and it was the imposition of stamp duty land tax on transfers of units in property investment partnerships that resulted in many UK real estate funds moving offshore in the first place. Next slide, please. Some analysis undertaken by Property Funds Research highlights this trend. UK domiciled closed-ended funds account for just 25% of the 257 billion euros of assets under management in vehicles launched in the last 10 years by UK-based fund management houses to target UK and European real estate assets. By contrast, 29% of assets under management is in closed-ended funds domiciled in Luxembourg and the Channel Islands. Next slide, please. As I mentioned at the outset, there are growing investor concerns about closed-ended funds targeting UK real estate being domiciled offshore, and these are reflected in the comments noted here. The concerns fall into three categories. First, reputational risk. For local government pension scheme clients, it is about perception and concern about future tax risk. And European institutional investors don't want to face criticism for tax avoidance. Second, oversight and management. COVID-19 has highlighted tax residency issues with offshore funds being forced to take decisions onshore due to travel restrictions. Third, costs. Offshore structures are expensive to set up and operate. This acts as a barrier to entry for many smaller fund managers, regardless of the quality of their proposition. Next slide, please. So to wrap up, a quick canter through the reasons why DTZ Investors is supportive of the PIF. First, as investors, we like the idea of being able to access wider opportunity set to meet our clients' objectives. Second, as a fund manufacturer and promoter, the PIF holds out the prospect of reduced complexity and lower costs. It also makes UK products more attractive to European institutional investors. Third, as a UK-based fund management business, it will be good to manage more funds onshore under the UK regulatory umbrella. The UK lacks a closed-ended real estate fund structure with tradable units, and with growing concerns about offshore tax structures, the PIF offers a viable alternative. And now I'll hand over to Melville to explain the progress on the PIF initiative. Melville.
Stephen, thank you. And morning, ladies and gentlemen. I'm going to focus on three issues. The key drivers for the PIF, how will it be structured, and what could be the next steps with this initiative. The key drivers focus on important decisions of the UK government last year and this year. Last year, the government introduced capital gains tax for non-resident funds holding UK real estate. This has led to a reassessment. Why, in the case of a fund which is tax transparent, unlisted, closed-ended hybrid, offering tradable units, does that fund have to be established offshore? May we have an onshore alternative? And then the second decision of the government, a welcome announcement in the spring budget of this year, when the government announced its review of the UK funds regime. Many of us hope that as part of this review, the government will consider the merits of the PIF. Let me now focus on the proposals for the PIF. How will it be structured? It is based on the co-ownership authorised contractual scheme. A contractual scheme which is unauthorised, meaning to say closed-ended or a hybrid. The eligible investors are those akin to the qualified investor scheme, professional investors, professional clients, with a minimum commitment of £1 million. Christopher will next cover the tax aspects, and I will home in on some regulatory details. We envisage the PIF operating within AIFMD and the equivalent regime post-Brexit with AIFM and a depository, and like the limited partnership, a form of notification to a registry in the event of it being established and material changes, including changes in the investor base. I should clarify that this initiative related to the PIF is different from those initiatives which have been advocating for the open-ended funds. Open-ended funds operate as authorised funds. As mentioned, the PIF is unauthorised. In advocating for the PIF, we clearly need to resonate with government and its goals. And I would suggest that there are several touch points. Brexit. The PIF offers an opportunity for UK managers to attract global capital. It can align itself with those government goals in relation to levelling up the nation, post-COVID-19 reconstruction. I am so grateful for the brainstorm, for the grassroots support in developing this initiative. The pension funds, the fund managers, the advisors, to AREF for approving and issuing the PIF submission, and to the Investment Association for including the PIF within their onshore professional fund proposals. So, what could be the next steps with this initiative? As mentioned, the government has helpfully announced its review of the UK funds regime. We hope that this will be a comprehensive review. It will examine the gaps in the UK funds offering and give us an opportunity to promote the PIF. I've been humbled by the number of organisations in our industry who have endorsed this initiative. To any others who are interested in this choice in terms of the UK funds offering, I set out as my final slide the text. Please do contact me. The campaign continues and any support would be appreciated. If you were to provide this form of endorsement, I'd be able to forward it on to the Treasury officials. Thank you for listening. And now over to Christopher on the tax aspect.
Thank you, Melville. I'll begin by discussing the tax objectives we were seeking to achieve with the PIF, before then moving on to the proposal itself. These objectives were part of the initial very positive discussions we had with HMRC and Treasury officials. The structure needs to be tax neutral so that investing via a PIF doesn't result in extra tax compared with directly holding underlying assets. There are a number of overseas structures, most obviously Jersey or Guernsey property unit trusts, that broadly achieve this tax neutrality. The PIF needs to compete on equal terms with these to succeed. The fund needs to be attractive to investors with differing tax attributes, so there should be no restrictions, legal or practical, on who can invest, other than the limit to professional investors. To be attractive, the regime should allow some liquidity for investors, and that means then there should be no tax barriers to dealings in units. We also requested some consideration to be given to seeding. If there was some ability to contribute assets in return for fund units tax efficiently, this would greatly assist the launch process for new funds and promote take-up. As many of you may be aware, there is an ongoing HMRC consultation on the tax treatment of asset holding companies within fund structures. The idea being to remove tax barriers preventing assets being held in UK special purpose vehicles. We have made the point that this review should include all fund types, irrespective of the top vehicle, and that therefore includes the PIF. At its simplest, as I'll explain shortly, the PIF would require only the deletion of a few words from the tax law. However, clearly, this would not be an attractive proposal for the government if it resulted in a vehicle that could be used to artificially avoid tax. So there would need to be anti-avoidance rules. We hope that a simple test for whether the vehicle is a genuine fund will be sufficient for this. There is a helpful precedent from the discussions the industry had with HMRC, on the introduction of capital gains tax for non-resident investors in real estate, which contained a very simple and broad definition of a genuine fund. So, having established the tax objectives, we move on to the proposal itself. This builds on the existing tax framework for authorised contractual schemes, and so is not wholly new. HMRC and Treasury officials were open to this structure as the starting point for a consultation. We discussed our view that the PIF should not be restricted in terms of its investments, so as well as real estate, it could include other illiquid assets such as infrastructure or private debt. As I mentioned, bringing the PIF into existence could involve a very simple change, almost just removing the requirement that the fund be regulated, allowing the same tax rules to apply as the ACS for an unregulated closed-ended fund structure. So, following this tax framework, in terms of direct taxes on income, the PIF would be transparent, meaning investors pay tax on their share of income based on their own tax status. There should be no tax charged within the fund, and no withholding tax on cash coming into the fund from UK sources. There should also be no withholding tax on distributions to exempt investors or UK investors. Overseas investors could be subject to withholding taxes on UK rent under the non-resident landlord scheme or UK sourced interest, but could register for gross payment or treaty relief exactly as if they invested directly in the underlying assets of the fund. For investing overseas, the aim would be for the fund to be considered tax transparent in other countries, allowing investors to benefit from their tax treaty access. For capital gains, the fund would be exempt, and instead investors would pay tax when they sell their units or the fund distributes capital profits. Capital allowances would be pooled at the fund level to simplify claims. In relation to transfer taxes, there would be no stamp duty or stamp duty land tax when dealing in units. We expressed the view that this exemption is essential for making the regime competitive. However, this also gives rise to a risk of tax avoidance, as the PIF could be used as a stamp duty wrapper, and so we would expect there to be a test of whether the vehicle is a genuine fund. To help with launching and growing funds from existing portfolios, we recommend that the government consider a relief from stamp duty land tax for the contribution of assets into a PIF in return for units, as is the case for ACSs. There would also be a clawback for relief if the seeding investor withdrew from the PIF within a short period. Finally, considering the VAT position, we recognise that this is a complex issue for the funds industry and somewhat fact-dependent. In some cases, it can be an advantage for the fund management fees to be subject to VAT. In others, it is not. Since this government has indicated it is planning a review of VAT across the funds industry, it therefore made sense not to be prescriptive at this stage on the VAT position of management fees and leave this as a question for the wider consultation. So that concludes the discussion of the tax aspects of the PIF. I'm now going to hand back over to Anthony, who's going to host the Q&A. Thank you.
So thank you, Christopher, Melville and Stephen. Very interesting. To everybody in the audience, please feel free to field your questions using the chat bubble you can see on the top right-hand corner of your screen. I'm very impressed. We have had almost 10 questions now from a variety of different people. So I'm just going to field some of those questions out to our three speakers. The first one is going to be, is there a Brexit dynamic to help the UK become more dynamic or competitive using the PIF structure? I think that probably goes to Stephen and Melville. Which one of you wants to go first?
I'm happy to go first.
Yeah.
And that's a very good question, because as I indicated, part of the dynamic is that the PIF, in the context of a post-Brexit world, enables the UK government to craft and design with the industry a solution which does not mean it is subject to the EU rules which ordinarily apply. And that includes VAT, Christopher has also covered. Stephen?
I think it was clear from the Treasury consultation request earlier this year that there's a keenness to see UK fund management in a competitive environment and to attract more funds into the UK. So in that context, one could say that the PIF fits into that agenda quite well.
Okay, very good. Here's the second question, and again, it's probably sort of split between Stephen and Melville. So, is the PIF an alternative to DB funds having to divest their money? So, can they allocate into a PIF product when it exists? Why don't you start with that, Stephen? You're a fund manager.
Yeah, it's quite a technical question, I think. I'll pass on that, frankly.
I agree, it's technical, and part of it is an unfolding picture of where the rules are going to be applying for these pension funds and what could be the legislative dynamic, both with those pension funds and also with the PIF. However, I do emphasize the point which I made in my presentation, that the PIF operates within the unauthorized regime. That is deliberate, and therefore for certain of these pension investors who may be constrained and having to operate within authorized funds, open-ended fund regime, the PIF may be of limited opportunity.
Okay, very helpful. Christopher, don't feel you've been left out. I have some questions for you. Why would the government agree to such a generous tax regime? And what do you think the potential benefits would be to the UK exchequer?
Thank you, Anthony. I think yes, in some senses it's a generous regime. Having said which, obviously to some extent the tax regime already exists in that it's really to create a level playing field between existing UK fund structures and Jersey property unit trusts, for example, which already benefit from most of the exemptions here, the exception being the seeding relief. As I said, that's an important aspect. It's possibly less of a crucial aspect in the sense that obviously the regime could exist without seeding relief, but if the fund, if it's going to take off successfully, then a seeding relief is obviously a helpful thing, and obviously and a seeding relief already exists for ACSs. I think as long as HMRC feels comfortable that this is not going to be just creating an opportunity for abuse, and it's genuinely funds that will be launched on this platform, then I think Treasury should be comfortable. In terms of the exchequer impact, clearly the fund itself is generating relatively small tax take, but there will be all of the ancillary services that are currently provided to funds that will be provided by UK suppliers and therefore will generate benefits for the exchequer.
Okay, that's very interesting. So we have another question which is quite lengthy, but I'm going to try and paraphrase it. In essence, it says, to the panel as a whole, what are your views on the likely cost and timing of establishing a PIF compared to alternative vehicles? This is something which is always uppermost in both fund managers and investors' minds, so quite a good question.
And I'm happy to go first.
Yeah.
As I mentioned, it's been crafted similar to the UK Limited Partnership. So therefore, unlike the authorised fund, there would not be the need for a pre-approval from the FCA. One imagines a deed involving a AIFM and a depository, and the investors subscribing by way of their subscription documentation. So a fairly quick and straightforward focus on getting to market with an emphasis on reducing the barriers for entry and making this a vehicle for which the initial establishment costs are kept as minimal as is sensible, taking on board the regulatory framework of an AIFM and a depository.
Okay. Anything from you, Christopher?
Yes, I think it's a. I guess it will depend to some extent on the conditions that HMRC and the government impose in tax terms. Clearly, if the tests for the barriers to entry in tax terms are too high, then it will become very difficult. If as I would hope, it's implemented in a similar way to the ACS with the genuine fund test that is comparable with the one that is used for testing whether offshore funds are eligible for capital gains exemption. I think it shouldn't be, in tax terms, a particularly onerous vehicle to set up.
Okay, that's really interesting. Thank you. We have another question, which is looking a little bit more at the regulatory side of things. So I think maybe, Melville, this might be one for you. In terms of the delineation that the FCA has to provide between open-ended funds and PIF, when do you think we will have some further clarity from the FCA?
Yeah, very good question. In developing this initiative, there has been a constructive dialogue both with the Treasury and officials at the FCA. From their perspective, the authorized fund regime, realizable security within a reasonable period, is there and well established. I have expressed the views that as the PIF operates as a closed or hybrid form, it is more risk averse. And it's been an argument which the officials understand. So it's a kind of recognition that here we are proposing for our industry a solution already on the books as an open-ended fund, but being able to operate in terms of equivalent investor protection, but addressing the risk concerns which the regulator quite rightly has.
Okay. So someone else in the audience has asked this question, which is about the, again, it's about a tax aspect. And how is the structuring of holding vehicles for assets going to be dealt with within this proposal? So will subsidiary entities of a PIF be treated on a tax transparent basis, or will they be subject to their own taxation issues? It's more for you, Christopher, I think.
Sorry, to some extent it will depend on the outcome of the asset holding company consultation that is currently underway. I guess it could be that the government goes one of two ways. One is to have a sort of group REIT type regime where effectively the fund attributes are passed down to all the subsidiaries. The other is perhaps to have a more limited exemption for SPVs in relation to particular types of income, for example, rental income, and then couple that with perhaps a widening of the capital gains SSE regime. So, you know, I would hope that whatever regime is in place, that the need for SPVs is not necessarily driven by tax, and the hope is that the regime wouldn't impose any extra tax just because you need to use an SPV within your structure.
Okay. Something that's a little bit sort of left field, so to speak. Someone's asked about the increase of synthetic products in the fixed income world. What features would you see a PIF having to adapt or adopt in a more complex derivative indirect landscape? I'll leave that to probably Steve, actually. I know you're not fixed income, but from a fund manager's perspective, or maybe for you, Melville. Okay, we'll leave that and you can think about it. We'll come back to it. I said it was a bit left field. Does the panel anticipate that PIFs will increase the volumes of transactions in the secondary market? That's quite an interesting question.
Yeah, and I'm happy to go first,
yeah,
because that's a very important question. Part of advocating the closed-ended or the hybrid solution is a recognition that within the UK, we have developed a secondary market, a match bargain basis for these trades. And insofar as investors can consider that as a scope for exits and also for entry, it gives a useful platform in which the PIF could operate. And you all would have noticed that within the PIF submission document, we referred to the market and the manner in which that operates within the UK. I'm also conscious that Stephen is experienced in the context of this secondary market. So Stephen, perhaps you'd like to comment as well.
Yeah, I think you're right, Melville. There is a very healthy secondary market in the UK. I mean, when we're praising funds, we don't we want to know that we can actually exit at some point if we need to, for the reasons I mentioned during my piece. You know, we've got portfolio rebalancing or even redemption requests. I mean, part of my responsibility is managing a fund of funds vehicle, and sometimes you get underlying requests for redemptions and need to move things around. So we do like to have the scope to move things out on the secondary market. And in theory, yes, it should actually increase the volume of traffic, particularly as there are a lot of a lot of those assets under management that I showed in the chart are in limited partnership vehicles where there's little or no liquidity, and so I think what one would expect there to be a higher level of secondary market activity, but we don't go into vehicles which are the closed-ended structures with very short-term horizons. You're in for a longer period, longer duration. And that's part of the investment rationale. But the secondary market does provide you with an exit route should you need it.
Okay, that's very interesting. Christopher, do you want to add anything to that?
I mean, I think from a tax perspective, clearly this is why the exemption from stamp duty land tax is crucial to this regime. If we don't have that relief available, then it really massively reduces the liquidity of this fund, and frankly, I think people will not launch this kind of fund when there are more liquid alternatives offshore.
Okay, sticking with you for a minute, can I just ask you another question that came in? Is why aren't the existing onshore funds such as ACSs suitable as an alternative to this new vehicle? For example, there's EU UTs, limited partnerships, REITs, PIFs, etc. So why would the PIF be better?
I think, as Melville said, this is about filling out a gap in the UK funds regime. All of those vehicles meet certain market demands, but none of them quite reaches this particular target. So an authorised fund, which obviously includes a PIF or an ACS, has the issue of managing liquidity and therefore the drag on performance. REITs have the fact that they have the market exposure and the potential for discounts, which means raising finances potentially more difficult, and the secondary market is less reliable in terms of exiting at NAV. And EUTs work well for wholly exempt investors, but don't allow a mix of different investor types in a single fund.
Right. Okay. Very helpful. Understood. Coming back to you, Stephen, how much of an impediment is the use of funds perceived to be in the tax havens for pension funds and local authorities when considering allocating capital?
Well, again, as I tried to indicate in the presentation, I mean, some of the feedback. I mean, I sit on the investment committee for CoLive, which is the London co-living fund that DTZ investors launched in the autumn, and the feedback from the capital raisers on that has been that a number of local authority pension funds are very concerned about their offshore exposures and won't consider it, but then others have indicated that they're supportive and have followed through with investment. So it is quite a variable picture, I think. But certainly the European institutional investors have been really quite strong. I mean, it's kind of an interesting one that CoLive is structured as a Jersey vehicle, but a number of institutional investors have pushed back on the Jersey vehicles, and yet they seem to be quite content to invest in Luxembourg. And I guess that's partly because it's EU and a regulatory environment that they know well. But I think it does. If we had something onshore, then it does open up that potential to bring money in and on a co-investment basis.
Okay. I'm afraid it's going to be a bit of a long technical question here, so I'm going to just read it, and I suspect it's probably going to fall back to you, Melville. Where will the line be drawn between a high, for example, eligible for PIF, and an open-ended fund not eligible for PIF strategy? There are many open-ended JPUTs that would like to be onshore but don't want to be authorised and subject to the constraints of the COLL rules. So it's possibly you start, Melvin, and then Stephen, you follow on.
Yeah, so that's a very good question. And what this is focusing on is the current open-ended fund regime. As I indicated, the obligation on the manager to provide reasonable, being able reasonably to realize value at NAV for units. That can create a challenge in the context of liquidity matching between the fund and the assets. So that expectation of being able to redeem is the mindset, quite justifiably, for the open funds regime. And as I indicated, there's been an element of proposals from industry for more flexibility. The PIF is that alternative. Because it's a professional investor fund, the manager and the investors can work out the redemption requirements, but not with that level of frequency which the regulator will necessarily expect within an open-ended fund scenario.
Okay, we've got a little under 5 minutes remaining. I think we've probably got time for 2 more questions, and a couple of really quite interesting ones here. Do you envisage European and global investors will be able to benefit from the tax neutrality of the PIF as much as UK investors? And that probably goes to Christopher.
I mean, certainly the expectation is that the UK would not impose substantial tax on non-resident investors, that they wouldn't suffer through any other means of investing in the UK. So clearly they would still be subject to UK tax on rental profits, and they would still be subject to UK capital gains tax and so on. But in terms of so the UK wouldn't impose any particular burden. There obviously needs to be a recognition of the tax transparency in other countries for this to work effectively, and clearly HMRC needs to work with international partners to ensure that it is recognised as a tax transparent vehicle in the same way as many other transparent vehicles, contractual schemes are globally. So I don't see any reason why it shouldn't be possible for overseas investors to benefit from the neutral regime.
Okay, thank you, Christopher. We have just 3 minutes left, and I'm going to suggest this might be the final question. And it's probably the golden question at this point in the debate. What is the timescale for the consultation and adoption of any new PIF structure? And is it a realistic option for funds seeking to launch within the next 12 to 18 months? Melville.
Well, very good question. We'll have to wait and see. We've got the review which the government has undertaken. Let's hope within the next few months there will be the consultation. On asset holding companies, that has already been issued. On VAT, on all these issues, which then will enable managers and investors to address that question. So it's wait and see.
Okay, we have literally 2 minutes left, so I'm going to go round the panel. I'm going to throw one question of mine in, starting with Steve. If you had to give one reason why you would want to see the PIF launched, and when would you like to see it launched, without saying ASAP, what would be your answer?
Taking the latter first, sometime in 2021 would be good. The sooner the better. And one key attribute, I guess, is that onshore tradable units.
Okay, Christopher.
I think I would agree with Stephen. I think that the benefit here is to have an onshore structure that allows particularly smaller players in the market to launch without the barriers to entry that there are for setting up an offshore structure, and likewise for investors to have a choice of something onshore that they can hold that gives them equivalent benefit.
And when? Okay, moving on to Melville.
When next calendar year, I take the view that this could be achieved with secondary legislation, given that the authorised contractual scheme is already on the statute book. And one key advantage is removing this complexity which we have within the UK and having to go necessarily offshore, and offering greater efficiency, reduction in establishment and operating costs for the new fund.
Thank you. Gentlemen, thank you very much for your time. A fascinating debate and a very interesting presentation. We are now out of time. I would like to thank the audience for all their careful thought and attention, and for providing us with some, I think, very thought-provoking questions. I have one person who has commented here about the actuarial standpoint, and that's John Forbes. And he is addressing the point in a seminar for actuaries next week. So if you wanted to follow up with John Forbes, I'm sure everybody knows him or can find him. I'm sure he'll direct you to that himself. But if there's any questions that people want to field in a post-webinar forum, please do feel free to write into AREF, and I'm sure they will be sent round to the panel for answers. once again, thank you, everybody. Have a safe day, and hope everybody has found this informative and useful. Have a good day. Bye-bye.
Thank you.